The Money Show.
Business books.
And on to tonight's book. It's not a business book per se. It is a book, I think, about leadership. If anything, it is certainly about leadership. We'll get to Bronwyn Williams in just a moment. Bronwyn, of course, is the agitator of thought. I think that's actually a much better title for her. She is somebody who thinks very deeply about the world and the way in which it works and doesn't. And so we'll chat to her about that. One of the more predictable outcomes, by the way, of the single biggest global event this weekend, other than Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger's shindig, is that fewer people in Britain tuned in to watch the coronation of King Charles III than did the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Now, according to Barb, which is a research organisation, it's analysed audience figures across 11 TV channels and services, and the number of viewers peaked at 20.4 million just after midday when the King was crowned. And kind of hoped that the Archbishop of Canterbury was going to drop the hat, but he didn't. That happened at Queen Victoria's son's coronation, I think. But anyway, the overall peak viewing was 9 million fewer than the number recorded for Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. Charles is going to have to do a lot of work on his popularity.
The Money Show.
Business books.
I'm so agitated because I have tonight's book, but I have two others to read before the Franschhoek Literary Festival, where I'm lucky enough to be interviewing three authors and Whitey Basson, about whom a book was written. But I've got a lot more to do than I've got time for, and I haven't had more than a cursory look at what I believe is a remarkable work by Justice Malala, very, very talented journalist, entitled The Plot to Save South Africa. She has had time to read it, so let's turn over to Translator Bronwyn Williams at Flux Trends. And it covers, very briefly, Bronwyn Williams, that 9 tumultuous days following the killing of Chris Hani. It was my first week on the job as a junior reporter, and you were, I don't know, were you out of nappies yet?
Well, barely. My sister wasn't even born yet, so there you go. We'll put it that way. But I do remember the time quite well. My parents moved house at the same time, and I remember the sense of fear and anticipation in the air with all the adults in the room, so to speak. And I think we tend to forget just how touch and go our democracy was in that week. And even in the year that followed. I mean, I think that's what Justice reminded us of in this book, was in the year that followed between Chris Hani's murder and the actual elections the next year, there were still 11,000 people that were killed in political violence. This was we think Eskom's a problem now, but we've been through a lot as a country.
No, I mean, those days, Bronwyn, oh my God, those days. It turns out, and history teaches us, that in sharp contrast to what that nasty Clive Derby-Lewis and the quintessentially evil Janusz Walusz's hopes were, which was to foment civil war in South Africa, and there was an element of it. In contrast to that, the killing of Chris Hani turned out to be the catalyst for change. It was the thing that tipped the balance. It was, at that moment, the Nats were digging their heels in, the ANC was pushing really hard, and there was a stalemate between the parties. They weren't making any progress, and this showed what could go wrong, and everybody was forced to put on their big person pants.
Yeah, I mean, as you did rightly point out in the introduction to this insert, is that it is really a book about leadership and lack thereof. And I think there's great parallels between what was going on with the formal leadership structures in South Africa with the Nats and the fact that there was not that much leadership coming from the top, and what's going on today, where we seem to have this massive leadership vacuum where, who's in charge of this place at the moment, right? And what can happen when there is a leadership vacuum and someone steps into that vacuum and takes charge of that situation? I think that's both a opportunity and a grand threat. And I have been writing about this quite a lot recently, how the lack of leadership and leadership vacuum that's on display right now was on the table, 30 years ago. Only then we were very lucky that it was filled by non-nefarious actors, whereas now we don't know what could come in to fill that void and how easily that leadership is taken hold of by someone who simply steps up and leads at a time when no one is leading. And that was the great shift that we saw there in the aftermath of the Hani assassination, how those that had power, at least in principle and on paper, failed to lead and how Mandela and the more sort of serious actors in the ANC at that point in time stepped into that void and took charge of the situation and ended up getting a whole lot more of what they wanted.
I have a slightly different recall of it, Bronwyn, and I'm not going to fight with you because you will beat me 6-love in an argument.
Go for it. Tell me about it.
No, but I mean, as I recall, F.W. de Klerk understood that he was not the guy. And I think Justice reflects on this in the book. He said at that point, F.W. de Klerk actually exercised a particular form of extraordinary leadership at that moment, knowing that he'd lost power, knowing that he could no longer exercise power without resorting to extreme violence, which he had a very powerful security service, which would have responded had he ordered them to. He chose not to do that. He chose to step back, and he said to Mandela, dude, go. You go on TV and you tell people what they need to hear. And Mandela, to his credit, went on TV, was it the night or the night after, and said, okay, everybody, let's calm down.
That's disputed in the book.
Hey?
That's disputed in the book. There were two speeches, apparently, and we all remember the second one as being the first one. Well, I don't, because I'm not quite old enough to do so. But
what was the first one?
It was an interesting piece of... apparently the first speech that Mandela made on the original, like the right when the news was breaking, was very scripted and not the statesman-like speech that anyone was hoping for at that point in time to calm the situation one way or another. But that he then fought very hard to get his actual opinion and a proper speech on the airwaves a day or so later, which was quite interesting because it's weird how our collective memory gets changed in these things. In fact, there is actually an effect known as the Mandela effect, which shows there's this whole delusion of many people across the world who remember Mandela dying in the 80s and are now totally convinced the man who led our country was an imposter. And it was one of those sort of like mass delusion things that go around, which is that's just a piece of trivia, but it does show that our collective memories do become distorted, and that we distort them for each other too, which is, I think, quite fascinating.
It's how our biases work. It's how our belief systems are formed. It's why the world's in the mess that it is, because very few people actually recall things absolutely as they occurred. I was chatting to somebody, I bumped into them on a plane, and they were reading a book about the transition. They were reading a book, a big fat book. It looked very textbooky and quite boring, but it was important, on the peace structures and how the national peace system worked in those days. And this person, who is very well read and very cerebral, was just saying that the caliber of leadership on all sides in those days was remarkable. And his belief is that if we've not lost that caliber of leadership, it's a caliber of leadership that up until now has not been willing to put up its hand to say, okay, I will fill the vacuum.
I tend to kind of disagree with that. And I think that this is something that's particularly unique to South Africa, and as to why it is and why it is not is, of course, something that could be up for debate and could make a fantastic PhD study. But South Africans have a unique propensity for waiting to be led and also respecting leadership, whether it is good leadership or strong leadership, which are two distinct things. Yeah. I mean, goodness and greatness are far from synonyms, and quite often they're quite the opposites. And what came through very strongly in Justice's book, going through here, was seeing how South Africans respond to leadership in a very humble and quite directed way. It's extraordinary, and we still do. I mean, we saw this during COVID too, like how grateful we were to be led, through these periods of crisis. We are a particularly obedient and patient nation, and I'm not quite sure why. Especially when you see a sort of protest going on about Europe, about very small things compared to the drama that we've been through. And the obedience that South Africans showed to just the smallest glimmer of leadership in that time is, I think, an extraordinary phenomena. And I think that's probably more what I'm getting at. It's a uniquely South African thing. It's not a phenomenon we see in our neighboring nations. It's not a phenomenon we see in the North. It's a very South African thing.
Which makes us highly susceptible to being led
to populists,
to being led by idiots. Yeah.
Yes, we're like too patient for our own good. We sort of make do with it. But I think it was remarkable how a few words of true leadership turned the atmosphere very quickly. That could have of course exploded in various different ways, and really made me think that if we had different leaders, or different voices, or different messages that came through in that week, how differently things could have played out. Onto that sort of open stage where people are looking to the top to see what they should do next. This was not for some reason, the the swelling wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming top down. And we were very lucky and very fortunate to have the leaders in place that we did have. And that came through very strongly in the book.
I once asked Rolf Meyer, and I said to him, could you and Cyril Ramaphosa, who Cyril was on the negotiating on the side of the alliance partners, and Rolf was tasked by F.W. de Klerk to negotiate on behalf of the National Party, could you have negotiated the deal that you did negotiate and get the settlement that you got in the social media world? And he said, absolutely not. There's no way. Social media has also destroyed
ground up, top down
the ability to manage information and to usher people in a particular direction. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I'm wondering what your view on that would be.
Yeah, it is an interesting one, right? Because it's like, on the one hand, we want democracy. On the other hand, there's like, it's too much democracy, right? Like that's what you're talking about. Like social media forces us to, everyone is part of the conversation, part of the discourse, right? So we're getting more votes in terms of the narrative and the stories that is coming through. We don't necessarily have more vote in terms of the decisions that are taken. But still, yes, it's much harder to negotiate in the social media world. It's not harder necessarily to get consensus, because that's a different story, and we could talk about that for ages in terms of AI and crypto and what that's pointing us towards in terms of sort of morality singularities. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing that it's very hard to negotiate in the social media world because of the way everything has been set up to become very binary and very polarized. I think you've spoken about some of the other books you've covered on the show about trying to find middle ground in a political discourse that optimizes essentially our social platforms and the way our attention economy works towards the edges rather than towards the middle.
What did you learn out of this book? What was the big takeout for you in terms of Justice's life and work, which is sort of poured into this single tome? Because he started, I think, roughly at the same time as I did in journalism. We were probably covering the same stories, didn't know each other back in those days. He speaks about
that. I think it's also like his first proper week at the job that this happened. The same time, incidentally, as the whole hostage situation was playing out and blowing up in Waco in America. So it was a very interesting week in the world, and how differently the American situation played out compared to ours. That one I think people thought would be resolved quite peacefully because the authorities had it in hand. And here our country was on this absolute knife edge, and we used it to come out of it a whole lot stronger. I don't know, there's a lot of sort of interesting parallels that could be drawn with the outcomes of that week and the fallout that we're still benefiting and or paying for, depending on what side of the pond you're in. I think it was a very pivotal point in the history of our country. And I think we have to be very grateful to the men and women who stepped up at that time. But I think that was the biggest lesson for me, that somebody had to step up. And even in his book, Justice does speak about how he even sensed, although he doesn't say that he wasn't there, but he was there as an observer, that there was almost a reluctance, even on Mandela's part, to step up into that void, into that space. There was almost a sense of understanding of the importance of what was said in that week and how that was going to set the tone for better or for worse, and depending on who was going to gain and who was going to lose in the forthcoming negotiations. But I think that the big lesson there for me is, again, this whole thing of that in a time when there's nobody actually leading. And again, like you said, that de Klerk used the opportunity because he kind of had to, was forced into making a decision to take us forward or not. But he also comes across as a very weak and absent leader in that week. Even if he was ceding power in the back end, he wasn't leading from the front. And this idea that there was no one stepping up into that space, and that someone had to be cast into that role. And I think we had very similar times right here in South Africa, whether we're going to get a sort of messiah or an antichrist type figure. I think that's up to us to sort of choose who we're going to sort of tie ourselves to going forward. But I think we have to be very wary of the fact that sooner or later someone will see that just by simply stepping up, you can take that space. And that is a space that our country would be quite willing to follow or to fall into. So I think we should take it as a warning, and also as a bit of gratitude to the fact that we were very, very lucky. We're not necessarily exceptional in that way, but we are very, very lucky to be the beneficiaries of good actors that stepped into that space.
Bronwyn Williams, Translator, future finance specialist at Flux Trends, looking at the leadership lessons out of the 9 tumultuous days following the killing of Chris Hani. The book that she is talking about, of course, is Justice Malala's new epic, The Plot to Save South Africa. It is going to be read by me, I promise, very soon. I've got to get through the Chris Becker book. I've got to get through the Elon Musk book, finishing the Oppenheimer book, Michael Cardo's enormous tome into the history of Harry Oppenheimer. I can talk to him at Franschhoek Literary Festival, talking to Whitey Basson, done that book, and it's marvelous. And so I'm really lucky. But it just means I have to, a dream deferred, there we go, reading Justice's book in the next month or two.